Greetings. Today we embark on what I consider one of the most fascinating and methodologically rigorous explorations in New Testament studies, the examination of pre-Pauline creeds and their profound implications for our understanding of earliest Christology. These ancient formulaic statements represent nothing less than a direct window into the theological convictions of the primitive Christian community, offering us unprecedented access to the very foundations of Christian belief. When we speak of pre-Pauline creeds, we must immediately clarify our terminology. These are not merely compositions authored by Paul himself, though they frequently appear within his epistles. Rather, they represent a distinct literary and liturgical species, formulaic declarations of faith that Paul incorporated into his writings, having received them from the broader Christian community. We find these creedal statements primarily in three locations within the New Testament corpus. First, and most prominently, within Paul's epistles themselves. Second, in the sermon summaries preserved in the book of Acts. And third, scattered throughout various other New Testament writings. Contemporary scholarship in the sociology of first-century Palestine, drawing from extensive archaeological and literary evidence, suggests that between 70 and 90% of Jesus' original audience was illiterate. Think carefully about the implications of this staggering statistic. In a predominantly oral culture where the vast majority of the population could neither read nor write, how does one ensure the accurate transmission of complex theological concepts? How does one guarantee that the essential message of the gospel, what I would argue centers on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, remains intact as it spreads throughout the Mediterranean world? The answer lies in the brilliant pedagogical strategy employed by the earliest Christian teachers, the development of memorable, rhythmic, formulaic statements that could be easily memorized and accurately transmitted. These creeds functioned much like the educational devices we recognize in our contemporary secular context. The remarkable pedagogical effectiveness of these devices becomes apparent when we consider that a 5-year-old child can flawlessly recite Jack and Jill or sing Amazing Grace while remaining unable to write their own name. This demonstrates the extraordinary power of rhythmic formulaic language to transcend literacy barriers and ensure accurate transmission across generations and geographical boundaries. Greek poetry, unlike its English counterpart, does not rely on rhyme schemes or uniform stanzas, but it does possess distinct rhythmic patterns. When we examine these creedal passages in their original Greek, they often exhibit a rhythmic quality pattern that would have made them immediately recognizable as formulaic material designed for memorization and liturgical use. What proves absolutely remarkable about these pre-Pauline creedal formulations is their overwhelming Christological focus. Approximately 80% of all identifiable creedal material in the New Testament concentrates specifically on questions of Christology, with the vast majority addressing the three central pillars of Christian belief: the deity of Jesus Christ, his atoning death, and his bodily resurrection. This statistical reality forces us to confront a fundamental question. If 4/5 of the earliest Christian liturgical and catechetical material focused on these specific theological affirmations, what does this tell us about their centrality to primitive Christian conviction? These doctrines were not peripheral concerns or later theological developments, but rather the very heart of the earliest Christian proclamation. They represented the non-negotiable core around which the entire Christian movement coalesced. Now, here we encounter what may be the most startling aspect of contemporary New Testament scholarship's treatment of these creeds, the remarkable consensus regarding their antiquity, a consensus that extends even to scholars who do not themselves embrace Christian faith commitments. Let me cite several specific examples that will, I believe, astonish you with their implications. Gerd Ludemann, the prominent German New Testament scholar who was quite explicit about his atheistic convictions, argued that the creed preserved in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, perhaps the most significant creedal statement in the entire New Testament, dates to approximately 30 to 33 AD, which places it within the first 3 years following the crucifixion and significantly prior to Paul's dramatic conversion experience on the Damascus Road. Similarly, Bart Ehrman, the well-known agnostic New Testament scholar, has argued that many of the sermon summaries preserved in the book of Acts, those extended creedal formulations found primarily in chapters 1, 5, 10, and 13, also date to the 30s AD, representing authentic historical reports of the content of earliest Christian preaching. But the scholarly consensus becomes even more striking when we consider the assessments of James D.G. Dunn, the recently deceased British New Testament scholar of international renown. Dunn argued that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed was likely formulated within months, not years, but months, of the crucifixion itself. Even more dramatically, Larry Hurtado, the American New Testament scholar who served for many years as head of the religion department at the University of Edinburgh, has suggested that some of these creedal formulations may have emerged within days of the resurrection event itself. Consider the staggering implications of these scholarly assessments. If these dating proposals prove accurate, and remember, they represent the conclusions of critical scholars working with rigorous historical methodologies, then these creeds provide us with nothing less than direct access to the theological convictions of the original apostolic witnesses. As C.H. Dodd, the distinguished Cambridge New Testament scholar of the previous generation, observed, while we cannot claim that these represent the exact words spoken by the original apostles, they were certainly popularized during the same period when the apostles themselves were conducting the primary evangelistic and catechetical work of the early church. The apostles were the ones preaching, the apostles were the ones establishing these communities, and the apostles were the ones responsible for the basic theological formation of early converts. Therefore, these creedal formulations must necessarily reflect the essential content of apostolic preaching. This represents what I would call a tight little argument, with enormous implications for our understanding of Christian origins. The significance of this early dating becomes even more apparent when we place it within the broader context of comparative religious studies. Other world religions for which I harbor no disrespect, but which present us with dramatically different source situations, typically rely on materials composed hundreds or even thousands of years after their foundational events or figures. British Buddhist PhD begins his study with a remarkably candid admission. He writes, "My Christian readers will notice that we don't have the data you guys do. You guys have the words of your Lord, we don't. You have the words of those who heard your Lord, we don't. And you have the words of those who heard them, we don't have any of that." He goes on to explain that most of the Buddhist selections included in his scholarly anthology date from 600 to 800 years after the Buddha's death. Even more striking is the situation with Hindu sources. The earliest textual material we possess regarding Krishna, and many Hindu scholars themselves question his historical existence, comes from sources composed over 4,000 years after Krishna was supposed to have lived. 4,000 years. Consider what happens to historical traditions over such vast temporal spans. This comparative perspective illuminates the truly exceptional nature of the Christian source situation. We are not dealing with traditions that developed over centuries or millennia, but with theological formulations that emerge immediately within the historical context of the events they purport to describe. This brings us to what may be the most revolutionary development in contemporary New Testament scholarship regarding the development of Christology. For generations, critical scholars operated under what might be called the gradual development hypothesis. According to this theory, early Christianity began with a relatively low Christology, perhaps viewing Jesus as a prophet or inspired teacher, and only gradually, over the course of several decades, developed the high Christological affirmations we associate with later New Testament writings, particularly the Gospel of John. This theory suggested that we could trace a clear evolutionary development. The earliest materials presented Jesus in relatively human terms, while later materials, especially John's Gospel, with its explicit affirmations of Jesus' divine nature, represented the culmination of decades of theological reflection and development. However, the recognition of these early creedal materials has completely revolutionized this understanding. The formulation, which has been attributed to various Oxford scholars but has now become widespread in the field, states simply, "The earliest Christology is the highest Christology," 7 words that encapsulate a revolutionary understanding of Christian origins. Rather than representing the end result of decades of theological development, the highest Christological affirmations appear to have been present from the very beginning of the Christian movement. Let me provide you with several specific examples that demonstrate the validity of this assessment. Consider first the magnificent creedal hymn preserved in Philippians 2:6-11, which declares that Jesus, though existing in the form of God, humbled himself to the point of death, and that consequently every knee will bow, every tongue will confess his lordship as he shares the throne with God the Father. This represents Christology of the highest order, Jesus sharing the very nature of deity and receiving universal worship alongside the Father. But here's what proves so remarkable. This is not a late theological development. This is early creedal material that Paul incorporates into his letter, material that predates his writing and reflects the theological convictions of the primitive Christian community. Or consider what may be my personal favorite among these early creedal formulations, Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Notice the clear presence of our three central elements: deity, Jesus is Lord; death implied in the resurrection; and resurrection explicitly stated. But the truly remarkable aspect of this passage becomes apparent when we examine Paul's use of Old Testament quotation just 3 verses later. In Romans 10:13, Paul quotes Joel 2:32, "Everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved." Here we must pay careful attention to Paul's exegetical method. In the original Hebrew text of Joel, the word translated Lord is the sacred tetragrammaton YHWH, the covenant name of Israel's God. In the Greek Septuagint, this becomes Kyrios. Now, when Paul declares in verse 9 that salvation comes through confessing Jesus as Lord, Kyrios, and then in verse 13 quotes the Joel passage about calling upon the name of the Lord, Kyrios, for salvation, he is making an unmistakably clear theological statement. Jesus possesses the same divine identity as YHWH himself. This represents Christology of the absolute highest order, and it appears in early creedal material. Richard Bauckham's groundbreaking work has demonstrated that one of the most reliable indicators of high Christology in early Christian sources is precisely this phenomenon: Old Testament texts that originally referred to YHWH being immediately applied to Jesus without explanation or apology. Larry Hurtado has similarly argued that the early Christian practice of offering worship to Jesus, worship that in Jewish monotheistic context should be reserved for God alone, provides compelling evidence for the earliest Christian conviction regarding Jesus' divine identity. Let me draw your attention to 2 additional passages that demonstrate the remarkable nature of early Christian Christological conviction. Hebrews 1:3 and the Philippians 2 hymn represent 2 of only 3 passages in the entire New Testament that explicitly address what we might call the quantity question regarding Jesus' divinity. That is, they don't merely affirm that Jesus possesses divine attributes. They specify the extent or degree of his divine nature. In the ancient world, religious thought typically operated with hierarchical conceptions of divinity. Greek mythology, Egyptian religion, and other ancient systems recognized various levels of divine being: major gods, minor gods, demigods, and so forth. Against this background, it becomes crucial to understand how early Christians conceived of Jesus' divine status. Hebrews 1:3 declares that Jesus is the exact representation of God's nature, not a partial reflection, not a diminished copy, but the precise, complete representation of divine essence itself. Similarly, Philippians 2:6 states that Jesus existed in the form of God. Now, in English, the word form might suggest something superficial or incomplete, like the rough framework of a house that lacks walls and roof. But the Greek word morphe carries much more substantial meaning. Its primary significance indicates sharing the same essential nature or substance. These passages, both of which appear to be pre-Pauline creedal material, affirm not merely that Jesus possesses divine attributes, but that he shares fully and completely in the divine nature itself. This represents Christological conviction of the highest possible order within a monotheistic framework. The evidence for early high Christology extends beyond these specific creedal passages to encompass various elements of Jesus' ministry as recorded in the earliest Christian sources. Consider several categories. First, the forgiveness of sins. In Mark 2, Jesus declares the paralytic's sins forgiven, prompting the immediate charge of blasphemy from religious leaders who recognize that such authority belongs to God alone. Jesus responds not by denying the claim, but by performing a healing miracle to demonstrate his authority, precisely the kind of divine validation that supports rather than undermines the high Christological implications of his action. Second, the acceptance of worship. Hurtado's research has demonstrated that from the earliest period, Christian communities engaged in the worship of Jesus, a practice that would be utterly unthinkable within Jewish monotheistic context unless Jesus were understood to possess divine identity. Third, the occupation of God's throne. Multiple early Christian sources present Jesus as sharing the throne of universal sovereignty with the Father, again, a conception that transcends any merely human or even angelic status. All of these high Christological elements appear not as late theological developments, but as features of the earliest Christian proclamation preserved in creedal materials that date to the 30s AD. This brings us to several common objections that are frequently raised against this understanding of early Christological development. Perhaps the most persistent critique suggests that Jesus was originally viewed as a prophetic figure whose message was gradually embellished and mythologized over time until he was transformed into a divine figure. This objection, however, completely collapses in the face of the creedal evidence. We are not dealing with legends that developed over generations, but with theological convictions that appear immediately within the historical context of the events themselves. The idea of gradual embellishment becomes untenable when the supposedly embellished material appears within months or at most a few years of the foundational events. Some critics raise questions about the reliability of New Testament sources generally, suggesting that as Christian documents, they represent biased or prejudiced accounts that cannot be trusted for historical information. This objection reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of historical methodology. As Bart Ehrman himself has pointed out, using his analogy of the American Revolutionary War, if we wanted to understand a particular battle between American and British forces, we would certainly want to interview General George Washington, despite the fact that as an American, he would obviously possess a particular perspective on events. Washington would indeed be biased in some sense, but this doesn't mean his account would be historically worthless. Historians are trained to work with sources that reflect particular perspectives, to cross-check accounts where possible, and to extract reliable historical information, even from sources that have clear theological or political commitments. The same principle applies to early Christian sources. The fact that these documents were written by people committed to Christian faith doesn't automatically disqualify them as historical sources, any more than American accounts of the Revolutionary War are automatically disqualified because they were written by Americans. You've asked about the potential presence of hymns and creeds in the patristic fathers, figures like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna. These early church leaders wrote between approximately 95 and 110 AD, making them roughly contemporary with the composition of John's Gospel, usually dated around 95 AD and extending only 10 to 15 years beyond that. All of these early patristic sources display remarkably high Christology. Ignatius, for example, explicitly calls Jesus God on multiple occasions, something so striking that even Rudolf Bultmann, who represents about as far left as one can go in critical New Testament scholarship, provides a detailed list of instances where Ignatius employs this divine designation for Jesus. However, from my perspective as a historian, these patristic sources, while valuable and early by most historical standards, are actually rather late for our purposes. When we can access creedal materials dating to the 30s and early 40s AD, materials that predate Paul's conversion and reflect the theological convictions of the original apostolic witnesses, why would we settle for sources from 95 to 110 AD? The earlier we can push our evidence, the more compelling our historical argument becomes. The pre-Pauline creeds offer us access to Christian theological conviction at its very source, not filtered through several decades of development. This raises an important methodological point that I want to emphasize. Even if critics were to argue, contrary to the scholarly consensus, that we cannot definitively date these specific creedal formulations to the earliest period, the more fundamental question concerns not the formal structure of the creeds themselves, but the content they preserve. The New Testament employs a technical term, homologia, which refers to the central faith commitments that defined Christian identity from the beginning. These homologia, these fundamental agreements about the core of Christian faith, clearly focused on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Even if we couldn't prove that specific creedal formulations existed in the 30s AD, we could still demonstrate that the content of these formulations, the essential Christological convictions they preserve, was being preached from the very beginning of the Christian movement. This is why Paul's encounter with early Christianity proves so illuminating. Paul's persecution of the church demonstrates that he clearly understood what Christians were teaching and found it sufficiently threatening to warrant violent opposition. What could have motivated such intense persecution? The answer seems clear. Paul recognized that Christians were making claims about Jesus that he viewed as blasphemous, claims that elevated a crucified criminal to divine status and thus represented an intolerable challenge to Jewish monotheism. Paul's very persecution of the church testifies to the presence of high Christological teaching in the earliest Christian community. He wasn't persecuting Christians because they viewed Jesus as a wise teacher or moral example, but because they were making the kind of exalted claims about Jesus that we find preserved in these early creedal formulations. Let me emphasize the remarkable temporal compression we're discussing. Gerd Ludemann, remember, is an atheist New Testament scholar with no theological axe to grind. Yet he argues that the message of Jesus' deity, death, and resurrection began immediately, his word, following what Christians call the Ascension, beginning with the first major sermons on the day of Pentecost just 50 days after the crucifixion. Think about the implications of this timeline. We're not discussing theological developments that emerged after decades of reflection and mythologizing. We're discussing proclamation that began within weeks of the events themselves, proclaimed by people who claim to be eyewitnesses to those events. This brings us to additional evidence from Paul's earliest epistle, 1 Thessalonians, typically dated to approximately 50 AD, though some scholars place it as early as 48 AD. What proves particularly significant about this letter is not merely its early date, but the way Paul writes to the Thessalonian Christians. From the very first verse, Paul employs the highest Christological terminology, referring to Jesus as Lord and Son of God, without any explanation or definition. He writes as though these designations are already familiar to his readers, as though the theological framework they represent has already been established and accepted. If Paul had been introducing novel theological concepts, we would expect him to provide extensive explanation and justification. Instead, he hits the ground running with these elevated Christological claims, suggesting that the Thessalonian Christians had already been thoroughly instructed in these matters. When could this prior instruction have occurred? If 1 Thessalonians dates to 50 AD, the Thessalonians must have received this theological instruction sometime in the mid to late 40s AD, again, within approximately 15 years of the crucifixion, and representing theological convictions that were clearly established and recognized at even earlier periods. Critics sometimes object to the use of early Christian sources on the grounds that they represent biased or prejudiced accounts. But this objection reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how ancient history must necessarily be conducted. Consider the example of Alexander the Great, one of the most significant figures in ancient history. Our earliest complete biography of Alexander dates to approximately 300 years after his death. The two finest historians who wrote about Alexander, Arrian and Plutarch, composed their works 400 to 450 years after Alexander's death, nearly half a millennium later. Yet scholars routinely cite these sources as reliable historical information about Alexander's life and campaigns. No one suggests that we cannot know anything historically reliable about Alexander because our sources are too late. Instead, historians work carefully with the sources they possess, cross-check information where possible, and construct historical narratives based on the best available evidence. When we apply this same methodological approach to early Christian sources, the comparison becomes startling. Instead of sources dating centuries after the events in question, we possess materials dating to within months, or at most a few years, of the foundational events of Christianity. Instead of sources writing centuries later with no direct connection to the original participants, we possess materials that claim direct connection to eyewitness testimony. By the normal standards of ancient historical investigation, Christian origins are extraordinarily well documented. As I often tell my students, we have more data than we need to reconstruct the essential contours of early Christian conviction. This abundance of early evidence gains additional significance when we consider the ultimate commitment of the earliest Christian leaders to the message they proclaimed. While we cannot historically verify the details of martyrdom for all the apostolic figures, we possess solid historical evidence for the martyrdoms of Peter, James, and Paul, what we might call the big three of early Christian leadership. These individuals did not merely teach about the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus as abstract theological propositions. They loved this message and preached it with such conviction that they were willing to die for it. This raises a crucial historical question. What exactly were they proclaiming with such passionate commitment? The message for which they died was the message of Jesus' divine identity, atoning death, and bodily resurrection, the same message preserved in the earliest Christian creedal formulations. Let me conclude our intensive examination by citing one final piece of contemporary secular scholarship that places our discussion in proper comparative perspective. There is a book titled Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad, a comparative study published in 2014 by Wiley Blackwell, one of the world's major academic publishing houses based in Oxford, England. The author, Paul Gwynne, serves as a lecturer in comparative religion at the University of New South Wales in Australia. This represents a thoroughly secular academic study with no Christian theological agenda. Gwynne's book asks a simple but crucial question. When we compare the source situations for these three major religious figures, how do they stack up in terms of historical reliability? His conclusion, based on rigorous application of standard historical criteria, is striking. Buddha represents the worst source situation, Jesus represents the best, and Muhammad falls somewhere in the middle. This assessment comes not from a Christian apologist, but from an Australian secular academic applying standard historical methodologies to comparative religious sources. What we have examined tonight represents nothing less than a revolution in our understanding of Christian origins. The recognition of pre-Pauline creedal materials has fundamentally altered the scholarly conversation about the development of Christology. Instead of a gradual evolution from low to high Christological conviction, we discover that the highest possible Christological affirmations appear from the very beginning of the Christian movement. These are not legends that developed over generations, not theological innovations that emerged through decades of speculation, but convictions that were being proclaimed within months of the events they describe by people who claimed direct access to those events. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond narrow academic concerns. If these scholarly assessments prove correct, and they represent the conclusions of critical scholars working with the most rigorous historical methodologies, then we possess in these early creedal materials nothing less than direct access to the theological convictions of the original apostolic witnesses. We are hearing, across the span of 2 millennia, the essential content of the earliest Christian proclamation, the message that transformed the ancient world and continues to shape human civilization today. That message, preserved in these remarkable creedal formulations, declares that Jesus of Nazareth was recognized from the very beginning not merely as a teacher or prophet, but as sharing fully in the divine identity itself, as dying an atoning death for human sin, and as rising bodily from the grave in vindication of his divine claims. This is the message of the pre-Pauline creeds, and it represents the theological foundation upon which the entire Christian tradition has been built. The earliest Christology is indeed the highest Christology, and these ancient formulaic statements preserve that conviction for our examination and reflection today. The evidence is simply too good to dismiss. We possess a wealth of early, reliable source material that provides unprecedented access to the convictions of primitive Christianity. When critics suggest that we cannot know what the earliest Christians believed, or that high Christology represents a later theological development, they are simply ignoring the best historical evidence we possess. The pre-Pauline creeds stand as monuments to the earliest Christian conviction that Jesus of Nazareth was, from the very beginning, proclaimed and worshipped as divine.